tithing is where we give 10% of our income to God. Obviously, we don't give it to him in person, so to speak. We bring it into the storehouse, which of course, for us as Christians, represents the church. We find the origins of tithing in the New Testament. Way back in the beginning, we read that Abraham brought to Melchizedek a tenth of all that he owned as a sign of gratitude and a sign of thankfulness. Now, Melchizedek, the Bible tells us in Genesis, that he was a king. He was also the priest as well. So Melchizedek represents Jesus Christ. He's a type of Jesus Christ. And of course the Old Testament is full of typology. And so Melchizedek, representing Jesus Christ, king and priest, that's who Abraham took his tenth to as a sign of thankfulness. And that's what tithing is. It's a sign that we're thankful, we're grateful to God for all that he's done for us, and in return we want to give back to him. Whenever someone does something for us that we appreciate, we give something back. It may be that we buy someone a box of chocolates, bunch of flowers, something like that. But it's a token of our appreciation. It's a token that we're thankful. And that's where we find the origins of tithing in the Old Testament. And of course, there are many other mentions as well throughout the Old Testament, culminating in the last book of the Old Testament, which is Malachi. And we find there that God challenges us. He says, test me in this, that if you bring your tithe into the storehouse, that I will open the windows of heaven and bring down blessings upon you. And that to me is a wonderful example of what tithing is all about. It's about a window of God's blessings being open for us because of our obedience through tithing. I think it's important to say at this point as well that tithing isn't a financial agreement between us and God. It should never be seen as an investment. When we bring our tithe to church and we put it in the bag, the collection plate, whatever it is that comes round, it should never be seen as an investment. In other words, we invest this into the kingdom and we expect that back in finance. It doesn't work like that. For me, finance is part of it. God does want to bless us, but bear in mind that he blesses us sometimes with our needs rather than our wants. I think there's a careful approach that we need to take, that we don't become too selfish. We live in a world that is very hedonistic, that is very self-centered, that is indeed very selfish. So we have to be careful that we don't fall into that trap. And tithing for the gain that we get back in return is totally the wrong reason for doing it. So we have to be very careful, I believe, on that front. So that's the Old Testament. From Genesis right the way through to Malachi, we find tithing referred to. But what about the New Testament? This is where a lot of people who are opposed to tithing, i.e. they don't do it, criticise people who today do promote tithing. But when we look at the Bible, because the main argument is that I've heard on many occasions said that it's in the law and we've been set free from the law. But when we look at Abraham in the Old Testament, we find that he started to tithe before the law, because the law came later with Moses. So Abraham was doing something before the law. So the New Testament, we won't find the same sort of references that we find in the Old Testament, but in the ones that we do, nowhere is tithing condemned. Nowhere does Jesus himself or Paul in the New Testament epistles and letters say to us that we don't have to tithe any longer because this is the day of grace. In fact, just to bring out one particular story from the New Testament, Jesus tells of two people that came before God. One of them was a Pharisee, and he came before God boasting of how righteous he was, that he wasn't a dirty sinner, but he was a righteous man, and of the things that he uses to endorse his own religious stand, he says, I fast and I tithe. And on the other hand, there's a miserable sinner who comes before God, the sort of person that can't look God in the face, that has his head down because he realizes that he's far from the Lord. And the man pleads with God from the heart, recognizing that he is lost in his sin, but he wants to do something about it. And Jesus, in that particular story, endorses the man with the repentant heart that recognizes his sin, and he highlights, quite rightly so, the fact that the Pharisee is a religious man, but doing all the right things, but not with the right heart. So Jesus doesn't say words to the effect that he criticizes the fasting or the tithing. He doesn't mention those at all in a negative light. In fact, from the connotation of reading the passage and the others in the New Testament that relate to similar stories, we find that it's accepted. He's doing the right things, he's just not doing them with the right heart. And that again, for me, is what tithing is all about. It's about bringing a tenth of our income to the Lord via the storehouse, our local church, and giving it to God with a right heart. Not, as I've said already, expecting a return. God will. The Bible tells us that he will bless us. He will multiply blessings to us. But it's about our heart being in the right place. If we're coming with a wrong motive, and we're expecting things like an investment, someone's given us some tips about some great shares to buy because they're going to go up in the next week or the next couple of weeks, and we're going to make a killing on the stock market, that's not what tithing is all about. In fact, that is totally the wrong reason to even consider it or to approach it. We give because we're thankful, like Abraham was in the book of Genesis. We're thankful to God. We want to be a blessing to God, because that finance into the local church, into the kingdom, can make a big difference. We want to be a blessing because God has blessed us first. So we give out of what he's already given to us, and that includes our jobs and our income and everything else. Ultimately, if we do recognize the sovereignty of God, we understand that although we may have worked hard, we may have studied hard to get a good job or whatever the case may be, but ultimately it all comes from God. So tithing is what we find in Genesis, where Abraham was so blessed by God that he wanted to give a tenth back in return. It's not a financial agreement with God. It is purely and simply us doing that out of a heart that has been so blessed by him. And in return, he will bless us, but it might not always be finances. In fact, you can read regularly in the newspapers and see on the news how sometimes people win the lottery and it ruins their lives. People with extreme wealth commit suicide. So if we think that just having money, just having possessions will be the end of all of our problems and it will bring peace and joy and happiness into our lives, we're really missing the mark. The greatest thing that we can search and long for in this life is to be happy, to have contentment, peace of mind, fulfillment, to have that inner joy in our lives when sometimes outside of them things aren't going very well at all, but inside we have that inner peace. And as we give to God, God will bless us in return. Sometimes it might be money, sometimes it might be possessions, because there's nothing wrong with having possessions. The problems begin when possessions have us. So there's nothing wrong with things, but God will bless us in that way. But most of all, he will bless us with peace of mind, contentment and fulfillment. And I believe that tithing opens the door to blessing. Are we required to do it? Well, it won't save us. Only a relationship with Jesus through the way that we all know we come to Christ is repentant heart because of our sin. We acknowledge that he died on the cross for us, that he rose from the dead, and we receive him into our hearts. That's how we get saved. Tithing won't save us. If we haven't gone through the way of salvation, putting any amount of money into the church every week will not make a scrap of difference. So tithing won't save us, but it's an actual act of obedience. When we give our finance to the church every week, what we're doing is we're being obedient to God. So in that sense, it's a key to greater blessings. I'm not saying that God won't bless us because we don't give, because that's trying to make God to be a bit of an ogre, really, isn't it? But the truth is that the more we give to God, the more he will bless us in return. The greater the measure that we use to him, the bigger the measure that he uses back. And that's a fact, as I'm sure we can all testify. And tithing will do that, as it tells us in the book of Malachi. God will open the windows of heaven and rain down blessings upon us.